Hey there, guys. Welcome to the Boob Business Podcast with me, the original Milk Diva. I am a former labor and delivery nurse and a board-certified lactation consultant in Austin, Texas. I'm the owner of Milk Diva Lactation, and I'm also the author of a best-selling book called Milked: Finding Your Flow and the First Few Weeks of Breastfeeding. This podcast is all about pulling back the curtain of all the things in breastfeeding and birthland. And so we're just going to talk about insider things people don't usually talk about in an unscripted fashion. So let's just jump right in, okay? Okay, so some of you have maybe seen that movie before called The Fight Club. If you haven't, the first rule of The Fight Club is we don't talk about The Fight Club. Today, we're not talking about The Fight Club, but we are going to be talking about vaccinations. And I have special guest, Dr. Joel Warsh, that's going to be on the podcast today. He's an integrative pediatrician out of LA, out of California. And he wrote a fantastic book called Between a Shot and a Hard Place. And one of the first things he says when you read his book is the first rule of Vaccine Club is don't talk about vaccines. You know, and this book and this conversation that we're going to have today delves into the culture of silence and censorship surrounding vaccine discussions. You know, his book discusses how the polarization of vaccine debates stifles open dialogue with advocates on both sides of often unwilling to engage in constructive discussions. And this, vaccine club mentality has led to a significant public distress and confusion, as well as lack of transparency that could help foster a more informed public. And so the whole point of today's episode is to help really foster an environment of learning, but also demystifying and taking away the stigma and shame that is often attached to when parents ask questions about vaccines. So, tell you a little bit about Dr. Warsh's background. I'm just going to read it straight from his bio. His name is Dr. Joel Warsh, aka Dr. Joel Gator. On his popular Instagram page, he is a board-certified pediatrician in Los Angeles, California, who specializes in parenting, vaccines, wellness, and integrative medicine. He's the author of Between a Shot and a Hard Place: Tackling Vaccine Questions with Balance, Data, and Clarity. He grew up in Toronto, Canada, and completed a master's degree in epidemiology before earning his medical degree from Thomas Jefferson Medical College. And he completed his pediatric medicine training at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and then worked in a private practice in Beverly Hills before founding his current practice in Studio City, California. So Dr. Gator has published research in peer-reviewed journals on topics including childhood injuries, obesity, and physical activity. He has been featured in numerous documentaries, films, summits, and podcasts. Just to name a few, he's been on CNN, ABC, NBC, Washington Post, Fox. And so I'm really lucky to have him on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to, having a conversation around vaccines that maybe, polarized out there in the world, which unfortunately silences people. And it's not the solution. But instead, one of his goals is for us to come together to discuss the debate and understand vaccine comprehensively. So we want to understand vaccines comprehensively, and we want to acknowledge differing viewpoints. And this can be the first step towards unifying, science-based actions for the health of future generations, so for the health of our children. So while the topic of vaccine often leads to divided opinions, it's a conversation we must have, and open dialogue enhances our understanding and helps us navigate the complexities of vaccine science. And this is all for the well-being of our community. So let's jump right in. Let's start discussing vaccines in a respectful tone using critical thinking skills. So let's hear what Dr. Joel, Gator Warsh has to say. Let's welcome him to the show. Hey there, Dr. Warsh. Thank you so much for being on my show. I really, really appreciate it. Do you prefer Dr. Gator or Dr. Warsh?
Either one, whatever one works for you.
Okay. What do your patients in your office call you?
I get everything, Dr. Joel, Dr. Gator, so it doesn't matter to me.
Okay. Terrific. Well, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about your background and what got you motivated to write this book, which I love, by the way. It's called Between a Shot and a Hard Place. So yeah, we would like to just learn a little bit more about what inspired you to write that book.
I'm a pediatrician in Los Angeles, and I would say, growing up, I always loved working with kids, and I went to med school to become a pediatrician, but I wasn't, particularly health focused. I was pretty healthy as a kid, but not specifically holistic minded. And when I met my now wife in residency, really opened up my eyes to a little bit of a different world, and eating a little bit healthier, and really just thinking in a different way. And of course, in med school residency, you don't really learn anything about holistic alternative care, but when you do even talk about it, it's kind of like it's woo-woo and out there and all crazy stuff. And when I started learning about it myself, as I started to get more interested, I realized really quickly that there's really nothing woo-woo about it. I mean, I was learning about nutrition and exercise and sleep and all these really vital topics, which we probably should have been learning in the first place, but we weren't really taught. And of course, you can get kind of woo-woo and out there if you want to with alternative medicine, but really nothing that I was learning was. And so I just really became interested and started to integrate that into my practice, and have been practicing integrative medicine for the last decade or so. And I'm not against modern medicine at all. I just think that there's a time and a place, and there are a lot of other alternatives out there that we could use. And oftentimes those could be very helpful in place or before we need to use a medication. So that's the way I would generally practice. But what you realize really quickly when you get into the integrative space is that parents have a lot of questions about vaccines. And I was getting more and more questions, and I realized very quickly I hadn't learned all that much about vaccines in training. And so I had to really learn things as I went and try to answer the questions the best I could. But the reality of the vaccine world is that it's so censored and such a hot topic, unfortunately. And so it really wasn't something that almost anybody feels comfortable or did feel comfortable talking about. And I felt it was very censored, and that was unfortunate. And so I talked about it in the office, but not really anywhere else. And then the pandemic happened, and I think, like most people, I got really frustrated with the messaging and how things were handled, and the lack of ability to have a discussion and the censorship around the word. And so that's what really led me to write a book about vaccines, because I wanted to talk about it more, and I wanted to have discussions and debates, but it just wasn't happening. And I knew that I would have to get as educated as possible because it's such a controversial topic. So I really did do a deep dive into the research, and then wrote the book. And things are obviously a little different now, which is great. And you can actually seem to have conversations about it, and people are super interested. And I've been really lucky to be on a lot of shows and podcasts and all sorts of things to talk about vaccines, which is great, because I think that parents have a lot of questions. And I think it's important that we can talk about everything. So that's what led me here. And I never thought I'd be writing a book about vaccines or talking about vaccines, but here we are.
I will tell you, so, I don't know that I'm embarrassed to say this, but it is part of my story. I definitely until very recently. So your book is not an anti-vax book. Okay. I'm going to put that out there for people who are maybe already just not even interested, because I'm going to tell you from my background, I was just like, listen, why doesn't everybody just get all the vaccines, keep everyone safe, and keep the party moving? We have a lot of other public health crisis we need to deal with. Why are we making such a big deal about vaccines? Let's just vaccinate these kids and keep the party moving, especially because I live in Texas, and we've had some pockets of big measles outbreaks. I am a nurse. I'm also ashamed to say, but this is the truth, so people know this, is that I did labor and delivery, and I was the one giving your baby the first set of vaccine, eyes and thighs, we call it. So erythromycin, Hep B, and vitamin K. Vitamin K is not exactly a vaccine, but it is something you should know why we're giving, and it is an injection. Erythromycin, not necessarily a vaccine, but something your baby's also getting, an antibiotic they're getting at birth, and Hep B, which you talk about a lot in the book. I'm going to tell you, I've never had any training on any of those medications, other than make sure you pull the pediatric dose, like safety wise, like make sure you're giving vitamin K, look at the, look at the vial, safety, how to administer medication in a safe way. The patients come in, they're laboring, and we as the intake labor nurse give patients paperwork. And so it's a lot of consents for care, consents for an epidural, consents for getting blood in case of an emergency, and then consents for vaccinations. Sometimes people come in and they're perfect. They're not even in labor yet. They're here to have an induction. And then some people are hot and heavy, huffing and puffing, and they're in labor. And we're having to ask them to sign these consents for vaccines that their kids are going to get in a day or two once they have their baby, or a couple hours. But there's not much of a discussion about the vaccines. It's just whether or not you want your baby to have them. And here's some papers to sign if you do, and here's some papers to sign if you don't. And so when I was reading your book, I was thinking, wow, I didn't know all the stuff that I was giving to these babies. And one of your main goals of this book, at least from the way I'm reading, is we just should have a discussion, an open discussion of what we're giving kids and why we're giving them. And is this the right time to be giving them? And so I say all that to say, you also took a big risk in writing this book, because you could really be ostracized. This can be convoluted, like your message could be twisted. And I just want to say, your book is clearly not an anti-vax book. Your book is pro-conversation. And I love that you started off talking about the Fight Club and how, the first rule of the Fight Club is we don't talk about the Fight Club. And that's kind of what's happening in the vaccine world. People are afraid to have an open dialogue with their provider because they're afraid they're going to get kicked out of the practice. And I'm going to tell you, I promise you, today is Thursday. On Tuesday, I saw a patient who told me her baby's going to be 8 weeks old. And at the 2-week visit, her doctor was talking with her about the 8-week vaccines. And the patient said she wanted to wait to do Hep B. And her doctor said, if you don't stick to the recommended Texas vaccine schedule, then you'll no longer be allowed to be part of this practice. And so now she's looking for another pediatrician. And you mentioned those kinds of things in your book. And because these are supposed to be recommended, right? This is a recommended vaccine schedule. It sounds a little bit like it's not really a recommendation if you're going to be kicked out of your pediatric practice for not following those recommendations. And so I'm just wondering if there's anything that you could share with our audience for someone who's in that situation. Hey, I just had a baby. I'm not sure. I want to do all these vaccines all at once at this 8-week visit. How might they approach their pediatrician to have, instead of having like a tug of war type of conversation, maybe fostering more of like a real conversation, not you and me and we're fighting about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think even before I answer it directly, I think I want, go back a little bit, because you did mention the book and kind of my position, but I think it's important to say, I'm not against vaccines in any way. In my practice, we give vaccines. I have kids that are fully vaccinated on the regular schedule, some that do a slow schedule, some that don't do it. Mostly people do at least a slow schedule in the practice. But my personal belief is we shouldn't be forcing people to do things. We should be educating, and we should be discussing, and we should be informing and helping people to make the best decision for them, but not forcing people to do anything. And that's really my general position. And I take that in the office, in the book, when I'm talking, and I just don't feel like people should be forced to do things. So that's really my position. And sometimes that can get even a little bit controversial, but I don't think it should be, because that's really the way all the rest of medicine is. And with the CDC schedule, like you said, it's not a requirement, it's a recommendation. And everybody's different, and there are different situations, and everybody weighs the risks and the benefits differently. And ultimately, that's the way I think we should be looking at it, not to label something as pro-vax or anti-vax, because most people are not in that camp. I think that those labels are weird and don't make a lot of sense to me. Like, most people just have questions, and they want their kid to be healthy, and they certainly don't want their kid to get a preventable disease and get really sick, but they also don't want their kid to have a bad reaction from a vaccine. And they read all sorts of things, and they hear all sorts of things, and maybe they had a reaction themselves as a kid, or maybe they had a reaction from COVID vaccine, or maybe they had a friend who had it, and now they're thinking about it. And there's a lot more vaccines than we grew up, and a lot of parents just have questions. And I feel like it's very unfortunate that it seems like lately, it's certainly worse in the last few years, that a lot of it is much more my way or the highway, like kind of get out if you don't want to follow it, like you mentioned in that situation. And I don't personally think that's right. I don't think we should be kicking out patients because they're not following the exact schedule, but ultimately doctors are allowed to do that, and it's not a protected class. I mean, I think it's kind of discrimination against your beliefs, but not exactly. I mean, certainly not a protected class. So you are allowed to kick out patients if you feel like someone's not following what you feel is best. And a lot of doctors feel like, well, if you don't believe in science, you don't believe in vaccines, I'm not the doctor for you. And I mean, I personally believe that we should be taking care of anybody, and like we're trained, if you work in the emergency room and someone just murdered somebody, you still take care of them, you still treat them. You don't really impart your personal beliefs on what they did or they didn't do. You just treat them. And so I think, at least for me, that's the way that I kind of look at it. But I do understand that position. But I think from the parent's perspective, to answer your question specifically, I think if you are having a baby, the most important thing to do is to interview the doctors if you have questions or you want to do, especially anything different with vaccines. If you want to do the regular schedule, then that's not so hard. There are plenty of doctors that will do that. But if you want to do anything else, or you at least want to have discussions about alternative schedules, or certainly if you don't want to do vaccines, then I think it's really important to not shy away from those questions and to ask them directly, because you want to be able to have open, honest conversations with your doctor. And if they're not willing to do that, then it's probably not the right practice for you. They're not the right doctor for you, and you don't want to go there. You don't want a doctor that doesn't want to listen to you or doesn't want to have a discussion, and you want to be able to feel like you can have conversation about that or anything. So if that's something that's important to you, then it's important to find a practice where you can talk about it.
Hey, mama. If you're pregnant or just had your baby, I wrote something just for you. It's called Milked, Finding Your Flow in the First Weeks of Breastfeeding. And it's basically the guide I wish someone had handed me before I became a mom. This isn't your average breastfeeding manual. It's real, it's relatable, and it's packed with insider secrets that I've learned from helping thousands of families as a labor and delivery nurse and an IBCLC. You'll get the truth about what actually happens in those first few weeks, the stuff no one talks about, and how to feed your baby with more confidence, less stress, and a whole lot more grace. So you can grab your copy now at Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, or Apple Books. You can even get it for, reading it on your Kindle. So just search Milked, which is spelled MILK''D, or head to milkedbook.com, MILKDBOOK.com. Because a more confident start means a calmer you, and that's exactly what your baby deserves. Mute myself. Okay, here we go. Yeah, I appreciate that input. I wanted to mute myself so I wasn't tempted to interrupt you, because there's so many things I got from your book that I just want to jump in and start chatting about. But yeah, I think interviewing physicians before you have your baby is really important. Here where I live in Austin, unfortunately, there's only a small number of pediatricians who will entertain the idea of a spaced out kind of scheduling for vaccines, and they have wait lists. So just knowing that if you're here in Austin, if you're pregnant, you should probably start your interviewing process now and get on a wait list. Tell me, what are some of the common myths or misunderstandings about vaccinations that you hear from parents? And then I'm also, before you start answering that, I'm going to flip the question.
Sure.
My second question will be, what are some common myths or misunderstandings you hear from physicians about vaccinations? Because after reading your book, it sounds like that might also be a pertinent question.
Yeah, I would say the biggest, myths or misperceptions is really an understanding of what the research actually shows and what research we've actually done. I certainly did not know what the research was before looking into it. You realize very quickly, I mean, just like you kind of mentioned in your story, I don't think most people realize it, whether you're a nurse or a doula or a practitioner or a doctor, like you don't learn that much about these things. Like you really don't, and you don't think about it at the time. Like I didn't think about it in med school. Yeah, you learn about the horrible diseases, you learn about what can happen from those diseases, you learn about those symptoms, you learn about how you can treat it, you learn about the vaccines that we have and how fewer cases we have of these diseases than we used to have, how great these magical vaccines are, and here's your schedule and go do it. And that's kind of all you really learn about it. You don't really get a course on all the ingredients. I mean, it might be listed or you talk about it for a couple seconds, but you don't really discuss it. You really don't look at the research. You don't look at how they were studied, other than maybe just the general way that things are studied, but not like specifically looking at vaccines, especially. And you certainly don't learn about why you shouldn't trust pharma, or why I made that joke in the book, like why you shouldn't trust pharma 101, but that should be a course. Like we shouldn't just blindly assume that pharmaceutical companies are doing all the right things all the time. So I think that we just don't get any of that training, and we really just hear, oh, well, the CDC says this, or the group of doctors says this, so let's just trust that and let's go forward. And oftentimes that'll be just fine. But I think when it comes to vaccines, there's so much that we really don't realize. And the way that vaccines are studied and the way that the liability works for vaccines, there are so many things that actually do have a huge impact on where we're sitting today with vaccines. And I don't think that most doctors or parents understand the lack of safety testing that's been done, especially long-term safety and cumulative safety for vaccines. There just really isn't a good mechanism and hasn't really ever been to study vaccines long-term, especially in the setting of having a chronic disease epidemic like we have now with kids, where 50% of kids have a chronic disease and 75% of adults have a chronic disease. It's not unreasonable to ask if vaccines could play a part in that in any way, could be associated, could have anything to do with that. It may not, but it's not unreasonable to ask that when vaccines are something that's meant to stimulate your immune system. And oftentimes that's just kind of shrugged off, or it's like, oh no, they're safe. They're just safe. Like, don't worry about it. And the reality when you look at the research is it hasn't really been done. We don't have any prospective long-term trials. We don't have any vaccinated versus unvaccinated trials. We are not looking at things forward long term in this light. And so the true answer for a lot of these conditions is we just don't know if it's associated. And that is something that's super important to parents, because parents see a lot of chronic conditions. They see asthma, allergies, autism, autoimmune conditions, cancer, all these things skyrocketing. And the natural question, especially in the age of social media, where you hear stories, you hear other people talking about, I went and I got vaccine and this happened the next day. It's scary to a lot of parents, and they have questions. And if doctors aren't willing to look into it, discuss it, then, and especially in the setting of COVID, after that, where we saw a lot of things that were said that weren't totally true, and a lot of things that were said that didn't end up being true, and claims about safety that later we're like, oh yeah, well you could get myocarditis, like, and that's not absurd or abnormal. Like, you don't know a side effect until it happens. But at the same time, when you're seeing all these claims so definitively being made, and then you see things not be true just a few months later or a year or two later, then I think a lot of people really started to wonder, well, if they're telling me this about the COVID vaccine, well, what else are they not telling me? Like, what else are they lying about? What else do we not have the true research on? And that's what we're seeing now. You're seeing rates of vaccination that are the lowest they've ever been, the most exemptions ever, the least trusted medicine, the most families asking for slow schedules. Like, everything is happening all at once. And I think that's because medicine really is not willing to have these tough conversations, and not really willing to admit what we do and do not know. And ultimately, if we did admit of the things we don't know, we could get that research and we could look into it and we could have better data. But right now, we're still kind of stuck in the safe and effective propaganda, which is not really ideal. I mean, we need to be thinking about things as risk versus benefits, and talking about it in that way.
Right. I actually love that answer, because you have the same answer for parents as you do for providers when it comes to the question, like, what are some of the common myths and understandings that you hear from parents and from providers? And it sounds like you're saying the research, there's myths and misunderstandings about how good the research really is. And I want to get into that in a second with you. I do have a disclaimer at the end of this podcast that basically just says you should talk with your doctor if you need. This is not a podcast for medical advice. And so I'm just going to say it in the middle of this episode too. This is not we're not trying to tell you if you should or shouldn't vaccinate your kids. You need to talk to your actual provider, because your baby, your family's health history, those are all things that they need to really individualize your care. So I just want to put that out there. But you talked about research, and this was something I was completely astounded by reading your book. Now, I'm going to say, once again, you are not anti-vax. Like, there's some vaccines that have been proven to be very helpful, have saved, there's polio, there's measles, there's all these things that are just, we don't have to worry about very much anymore. They're not taking lives by the tens of thousands of people anymore. And that's really where my brain has been all these years. Shut up and get the vaccine. Stop complaining. People are living, right? And it's fascinating that what we're about to discuss and what's in your book, which I think is a fantastic book for any pediatrician, any medical professional, anyone that's in charge of or interested in knowing why vaccines is a controversial subject and wants to know the science behind it, they should definitely read this book. But we talk about the science and we talk about the research. Let's talk about placebo. So there is what people say, what we're told at the pediatrician's office, what the papers say when we give to the patients, here's your baby's Hep B vaccine information, and they get this sheet. There's a little bit of warning signs and side effects. And it says this vaccine is safe and effective. And they're making that statement based on some clinical trials. There's preclinical trials, and then is it called post-market or I don't know the name of it, post-market trials.
Yeah, post-market.
That means once it's been released to the public, they continue doing trials. But pre-market trials or clinical trials are done before they're released to the public. And can you talk to us a little bit about why it is true to say there's documentation showing that vaccines are safe and effective, but why that same sentence needs to be unpacked, and how studies are run using a certain kind of placebo, or why these statements are a little bit nuanced. And I know I'm speaking a little cryptically because I don't want to give away too much from the book, but talk to us about the importance of how these studies are run and where maybe there's why those studies are maybe a little faulty.
Yeah, and feel free to say anything. You don't have to be cryptic because there's no secrets here.
Okay.
I mean, I'm totally fine. People who don't, they don't have to read the book. I don't care. Like it's more about
Sometimes
like
I'm like,
having discussions.
like reading. Like when you watch a show on Netflix or whatever, you're like, I don't want to give it away. And so, if I
there's
feel
no
like it's so
secret
good, I don't
ending
want to. Okay. You're right. There's no secret ending. We are having a lot of work to do ahead of us. So yeah, the book does talk about, hey, that word placebo. Most of us think of placebo as I'm giving an inert substance. So I'm testing this medication, this vaccine against something like saline or sugar pill or something that has no medicinal effect, something that is totally inactive. And that's what medical trials usually, when they say placebo, that's what that word means. However, what I learned by reading your book, when they're doing clinical trials on vaccines, they are testing a new version of the vaccine against a quote unquote placebo, but the placebo is actually an older generation of the vaccine. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because, like you said, so I did a master's in epidemiology. I've done research in the past, and so I have learned these terms, and most doctors have learned the term placebo, and you would take that to mean an inert substance, meaning something that would be in the body that wouldn't really do anything to the body, so that way all the effect would be from the actual thing that you're studying, so salt water, saline, something like that. That's what I always assumed the word placebo meant, and when you ask a doctor, have they been placebo trialed? Oh yeah, all the vaccines have been placebo trialed. Of course they have. But when you actually look at the research, really all the vaccines on the childhood schedule in America were never safety trialed with an inert placebo originally, pre-licensure. So that is really important because the best possible safety testing that you could get would be with an inert placebo. And the reason why you say that is if you're testing vaccine 1 versus vaccine 2, and in both groups they have 10 seizures, you could say, well, both groups have 10 seizures, therefore both are safe and they're equally safe and there's no safety concerns, which is very different than, say, if you did a different study where you had vaccine 1 versus vaccine 2 versus saline, and you had 10 seizures, and 1 seizure. You could see how that's very different and why having that saline placebo group is really important for safety, because you're identifying there's a big difference there. The older vaccines, the ones that were originally put on the market in the 40s, 50s, 60s, none of those were saline tested because they weren't really doing that back then. Only the oral polio vaccine was a part of that research, but that's not even the vaccine we use anymore today for kids. It's not the same vaccine that we're using today for kids, so it's different. So the vaccines that we actually use today weren't studied in that way. Once you have a vaccine on the market, it then becomes unethical to give somebody saline, because then you're saying, well, there's a vaccine on the market that works, so therefore we can't not give it to kids, so therefore we have to study against the older vaccines. So we have this issue in the vaccine literature where, one, people just don't actually understand how they were studied originally. We don't have absolute safety for most of these, and for many of them we've only studied the newer one versus the older one, and so we don't have the best possible safety testing to really have a good baseline. Does that mean they're unsafe? No, it doesn't mean they're unsafe. It just means we don't actually know the baseline data in the way that we should, and that's when people are arguing about it, where sometimes they're not understanding the wording, and some people are saying, we want inert placebo-controlled testing. We should require that. We absolutely, for something that's absolutely brand new, we should say and require, I think the FDA should say, look, we're not licensing a new product that's never been on the market before, that there isn't something else out there already, without the pharma companies doing saline trials. Like, that should be a baseline. It should have always been a baseline, because then we have the absolute safety, but we don't have that. Now, when there's something on the market already, that's different. That's a little bit more complicated. And that's something where maybe we would need to do now some prospective trials to look and see moving forward how these, what kind of reactions people have versus kids that are unvaccinated. That's also never been done. And I would think we've had tons of research on vaccinated versus unvaccinated kids, but they actually have not ever done that. So again, as a practitioner, it's very surprising to me what the research actually is. And the definitive nature of the things that we sometimes say are not actually true based on what the research truly is. And I didn't know that. I don't know who would know that unless you actually go look at it. And I think it's important to understand.
Yeah.
I think it really is, because that's where a lot of families are coming from when they're talking about this, and they do know the research, where I don't think a lot of the doctors actually do.
It's totally crazy. So I am going to say a lot of our parents are sleep deprived. So I am going to kind of redigest what you just said in a way that if I was a half asleep, half awake person would understand. The first thing I'm getting from what you're saying is that most doctors do not know that when they're looking at the research, when they open the little package insert of the MMR vaccine, for example, or any vaccine, and it says it's been tested, and they actually look at the study and it says a placebo arm, they don't realize that that placebo arm is not held to the same standard of what the word placebo means in other pharmaceutical trials, and that placebo actually is an older version of a vaccine. So those kids or those people that are getting a placebo are not actually getting saline or something that's inactive. They're actually getting an older version of a vaccine. And then the arm of the study that's showing the person that got the vaccine is the newer version. So if we have two arms, placebo meaning old vaccine, drug or vaccine meaning the new test, that if the new drug, the person has, those people out of 100, let's say 5 have a seizure, and the old medication 5 had a seizure of the same sample size, they'll say, oh, this new vaccine is safe and effective because there's no increased risk of whatever the bad side effects, like seizure in this case, compared to the old medication. So they consider that to be safe and effective, but nowhere in that trial did they actually test that medication against a non-chemical substance like saline or a sugar pill. Because then we're not sure, but we might see, oh, a sugar pill would give 0 seizures, and then the actual vaccine is giving 5 seizures. So the public should be informed that that is perhaps a risk that they would take. Is that a true statement?
That's a very true statement. So that is exactly what it is. And it's not, again, to say that these are unsafe, but you're not getting informed consent if you don't actually realize what your risk is. And especially when you're giving something to a healthy child, they aren't sick with something. So you have to make sure that what you're giving to them doesn't create more problems than it's actually preventing. And when you don't study it in that way, it's really tough to know if it is causing, let's say, more seizures or not, because you're just studying against an older version of a vaccine. And that's the way that the vaccines on the childhood schedule have been studied. Some outside of that schedule have been studied with placebo. The COVID vaccine actually was. Some of the trials were with placebo, but basically none of the other ones were. And so I just think that's important to understand. And that's not the only important thing. You also have to keep in mind that this is still just short-term safety. Those trials are usually a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a few months, if you're lucky, maybe a year or 2 on a really good trial, but they're not usually even that long. So we don't know anything about long-term safety, and things like asthma, autoimmune conditions, cancer, autism, allergies, ADHD, all these things take a long time to develop, and we're not collecting that information when you're doing a trial and the thing's already on the market. And so then you say, oh, well, we didn't see any safety signals, but you didn't study it. So we have this relative safety, then we also don't have long-term safety. And so it's really very difficult. And I think still it's very difficult to this day to really properly counsel families on the risks from vaccines. We don't actually know them. And I think that's really important, because I think we do understand the benefits really well. We do understand the diseases. We understand how severe they can be. We understand how many people get them. We understand how the vaccines work. We understand how well they work. We understand, I think, pretty decently the short-term side effects of vaccines, but I don't think we have a great understanding of the long-term side effects. And I think that's really important when most of these diseases are super rare and don't occur very often anymore. And certainly some of them don't occur as much because of vaccines. I mean, there's no question about that, but it's not an either or. And I think medicine really falls into this issue. It's like, oh, you want a bunch of kids to get measles and die? No, of course not. Like, you don't want people to get sick, but you also don't want to create side effects or other problems. And if you can't have a discussion and you can't talk about it and we don't study it, then we can never make the vaccines better. And if a vaccine, let's say, does increase your risk of seizures by 50%, or does contribute to asthma or allergies or autoimmune conditions, wouldn't we want to know that? Like, we're not studying it, but I think we would want to know that, because then you'd say, okay, why? And then maybe you could figure out an ingredient, or you'd adjust the schedule or whatever it is to decrease that risk. And then you could have a safer vaccine that still works. And it's not like we've never taken a vaccine off the market for safety concerns. We of course have. It's not like we've never taken a medication off the market for safety concerns that pop up later. We of course have, but there's nobody really pushing to make vaccines safer. And I think that's a big problem when you have a lot of parents that are just very concerned about safety in general. It doesn't seem like the mainstream is really listening to those parents or being willing to have those discussions. And I think it's really important. And not to mention, these studies are generally done on a vaccine, not all the vaccines. And so how is the cumulative vaccine schedule affecting kids? If you're giving them 10, 15, 20 vaccines, does that have an effect long-term on asthma, allergies, autoimmune conditions? Those are important questions.
Yeah, yeah. What I hear you saying and what I've heard you say while reading your book is informed consent is the goal here. And how can we really have true informed consent if y'all don't even know that the placebo arm of this medication is actually another medication? So that's the first thing that I'm hearing, and I was really surprised by. The other thing that maybe people don't quite understand if you're not in the medical field is that it is unethical if there is a substance that can reduce harm to a child for you not to give it to them. And so that's the way, I guess, that has been justified. Hey, we can't do a real placebo because that means we would be withholding medication to this or withholding a vaccine that could really help benefit this child. So if we don't give it to them and something happens to them, that's really unethical. So they're having to vaccinate kids with older versions and test it against newer versions. But what I loved about your book is you did offer a solution. So the book is not just about like, wah, 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 these are all these things that are wrong. There's some solutions in there. So would you mind sharing, like you talked about it, you touched on it a little bit, but another option for maybe testing kiddos whose parents have voluntarily chosen not to vaccinate their kids, and maybe expound on what a properly designed study could look like?
Yeah, to me, the answer to a lot of this is to start some prospective trials looking at vaccinated versus unvaccinated kids. You're very unlikely, almost for sure, not going to have a randomized trial because you're not going to give people vaccines that don't want them, and you're not going to not give people vaccines that do want them. But you absolutely could do a study where people are allowed to choose and you follow them forward. And there are plenty of people that don't vaccinate and they're, I'm sure, happily volunteer for a study, and you can follow them forward, and you can follow kids that are vaccinated forward, and you can look at different schedules and the timing, and unvaccinated kids, and if they want to get vaccines, they can do it, and that's fine. And you just follow a group forward, and then you can see does the group of unvaccinated kids differ in any way? Are they healthier? Are they getting fewer cancers? Are they getting fewer autoimmune conditions? And of course, there are other things that might be different about those kids, but at least you'd still have a lot of information about vaccinated versus unvaccinated lifestyle and see if you're noticing differences. And that would be much better research than we have. And I think would be very helpful for doctors, practitioners, and families to feel more confident, because if both groups are exactly the same on autism and allergies, you'd be like, okay, well, that doesn't really make any difference. That's what we've been saying for so long, and that's what's true. But if it is truly different, then we would need to figure out why, and we would need to think about that. And it's not really ever been done. The only thing we have is retrospective epidemiological studies, and those are very potentially biased by your opinions, and you can adjust them as you would like. And so they're useful, but they're just not ideal. And that's why oftentimes you'll get a very pro-vaccine person get a very pro-vaccine answer on their epidemiologic study, and a very anti-vax person get an anti-vax type result on their study. And then you're like, okay, well, which one is it? And that's where the prospective studies are much better, because you can't really fudge the data or adjust it as much to meet your beliefs. So I think that's what we need to do. I think we should do it. I think it's a really important question, and I think it could be done. It's obviously not easy. It's expensive and takes a long time, and hopefully we'll have multiple of them across the world that would do this, so we could really track it forward. But I think that is what we need to do at this point. And I think we want to protect kids from disease, but we also want to do it in the safest possible way. And I think it's very arrogant to assume we have the best vaccines we're ever going to have in human history and we can't do it better or safer. I think we always could. And I think if we are able to talk in that way, it's not anti-vax in any way. It's just, let's do this as good and safe as possible. And right now, I don't think we're having that discussion very often, especially in the setting, which most people probably don't realize, but you can't sue vaccine companies.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
So when did that, you talk about that in your book, and you mentioned it briefly. So go ahead and expound on that. I'm sorry. It was very exciting to hear that one. I was like, oh, I did not realize that there was a point in time where laws got changed, and so now we cannot sue vaccine companies.
Right, and I think this is something that's really important that most people just wouldn't realize, because why would you know this? I mean, certainly didn't know it, but it really does affect the landscape, because what happened in the 80s is with the DTP vaccine, so diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, the original one, there were a lot of concerns, especially around that vaccine in terms of neurologic complications, so seizures, encephalitis, brain inflammation, and there were a lot of lawsuits. And because there were so many lawsuits, there was a big concern that the companies were not going to be making money who were making vaccines, and so a lot of the companies that were making vaccines stopped producing vaccines. They didn't want to do it anymore, and so there were only a few left. And there was a big concern that they would all just stop making vaccines because there were just too many lawsuits and it was too much money. So the government stepped in and decided to create the Vaccine Act, which is in 1986, and it protects the companies. So you basically can't sue a vaccine manufacturer in any way. It's technically possible, but really doesn't happen. You can't really sue them. So you sue the government if you have an injury, and there's a special fund that will pay if it's determined that you had a vaccine injury. So you can't sue those companies. And why that matters is because in a society, a capitalist society like America, the main check and balance on companies is being sued. And usually that's what makes the pharma companies do really long-term trials. So they'll get a new medication, they'll study it for 5 or 10 years. They want to make sure there's no long-term side effects because they don't want to get sued up the wazoo a decade later when everybody has a problem. But when you don't have that, then there's really no reason for a pharma company to want to find any problems with their product. They have all the reason to try to get their product on the market. They want to have as minimal safety testing as possible. They want to prove that it works, so that way you get on the market. They want to not show any problems with the vaccine. They don't want to study it as much as possible because they don't want to find anything. Because once they get on the market, then you have to get it because it's on the schedule. The doctors and government does all the marketing. They have to pay for it, and you can't sue them. So they have no reason to make them as safe as possible. They have no reason to make them better, and they have no reason to keep studying them once they get on the market. So they have all the push to get it out there. And that's not, nefarious or conspiracy. That's just the way that it works. And so when you don't have that check, and then there's really nobody doing that research, like why would a pharma company today be like, oh, well, let me look into hepatitis B vaccine. All right, let's do $1 billion study. Let's study these two groups. Let's see if we can find a problem so we can pull our product off the market. Like, they have no reason to do that. So unless somebody else does that kind of research, we're never going to find other problems. We're never going to make them make it better because they don't have to.
I was very surprised by that too. But I love that you're bringing this stuff, just open to the front. I don't know that many other people think about this, but this is the health of our future generations. So far, we've mentioned the word autism several times. I know everyone wants to know, like, what, from your perspective, is the research able to show at this time about vaccines and autism? It's a little bit of a, maybe charged question, but it is a hot topic I'm sure you're used to handling.
Yeah, it's the most charged topic. I mean, vaccines are charged, and then autism is like the top of it. And I would say in my whole life, this was the most surprising thing I've ever seen when I looked into the research on autism, because we're told so definitively that we have all this science, the science is settled, it's been debunked. And then when you go look at the actual research, it's so far from debunked or settled. It just doesn't even make any sense that it's being said. We just haven't done that research in any way, shape, or form that would lead somebody to have that conclusion. It's crazy to me. Like we have looked at MMR, we have looked at thimerosal, which is the mercury component, but it's not even in vaccines anymore. But we haven't looked at all the vaccines. We haven't looked at the rest of the vaccines, and even the MMR research. It's retrospective research, and it's usually the studies where kids that got MMR versus no MMR in the setting of getting all their other vaccines. So to say that vaccines don't cause autism doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because you'd have to study it first. So we can't say that vaccines do cause autism. The answer is we don't know. And anybody that would look at the research would I think conclude that if they looked at it themselves and looked at what is available. But for whatever reason, it's been so definitively pushed on us that vaccines don't cause autism. We know that vaccines don't cause autism. And I just could not believe it. Like, I just did not think that that's what the research, I thought I did not be finding something. And so I had to stop. I tried to look in every other place. I read a bunch of books, super pro-vaccine books, Paul Offit's books, Peter Hotez's book, all these individuals that are super pro-vaccine. And they don't have any other research either. And when you hear them talk about it, especially when they're on the stand, especially in like Aaron Siri type, who's one of the main vaccine lawyers, when he's deposing people, like the reason that we say that vaccines don't cause autism, when you ask those professionals, is because the research doesn't show that vaccines cause autism. So they're basically asked like, well, does hepatitis B vaccine cause autism? No, it doesn't. Well, do you have any study to show that? No, I don't. So therefore, we don't know that vaccines cause autism. Therefore, it doesn't cause autism. That's not the right answer. The answer is I don't know. But because there isn't research showing that vaccines do cause autism, the statement is there's nothing proven that vaccines cause autism. Therefore, it doesn't. And that's
so with the MMR vaccine, is that also the same?
So there is some research on MMR. There absolutely is. But nothing's prospective. It's still MMR in the setting again the other vaccines. But the research that has been done so far doesn't show that MMR increases your risk for autism in and of itself. So what you could say based on the research so far is there's, I would say, moderate level research on MMR that in the setting of getting your other vaccines, getting MMR2 doesn't increase your risk for getting autism. That's the research that we have so far, because the studies that we do have showed that. But it's only MMR.
But there's no comparison of like kids who are getting a bunch of vaccines compared to kids who are not getting vaccines.
No, it's never been
which
done.
arm. Okay, so that's what I just wanted to clarify.
Which is crazy, because you would think there was so many. Like you would think, I thought that there was like all these big studies, databases. Whoa, and I guess like, well, why don't they just take this database that we have and compare vaccinated to unvaccinated kids? Exactly. Like that's what they should do, but that's never been done, not once. And so the question then is, okay, why? Like, why would they not do that? You would think that would be the first thing that would be done. Yeah. You have big databases like Kaiser and Harvard and whatever. Like you would think someone would get in there and be like, all right, vaccinated kids, unvaccinated kids, how many kids have autism? Yeah. It's a pretty simple study to do. It wouldn't take very long. So then the question is, well, was it done and people didn't find what they wanted to find, and so they never did that research, or did they just not want to look, or were they just so sure that it was not a problem and they never looked? I don't know, but I would think that the first thing you would do to combat the anti-vaxxers, air quotes, or Secretary Kennedy, or whatever you wanted to, you would say, look, we looked at 10 million kids in Denmark and this place, and we looked at all the unvaccinated kids versus the vaccinated kids, and there's no difference. That would be the first thing that I would do. So I can't think that they wouldn't think to do that. Right. It just leaves you to kind of sit there, and you don't want to be conspiratorial, but like, did they actually look and not find what they wanted to find? I don't know. Okay. Like that's the only thing that makes sense to me, but it's weird that stuff doesn't exist.
Right. In your book now, you do talk about the importance of considering certain vaccines. And of course, this has a lot to do with, you talk about like, you have to know your family's history and your baby's health status, and if they're premature or not premature, if you have other existing conditions. But you do talk about things like RSV and measles, like, and the fact that we had polio vaccine, that there is, like, they have done significant, and it's helped improve health outcomes towards these diseases. And you give a lot of credit to some of these vaccines. So I want to make sure that that's also discussed. I just want to give you an opportunity before I start asking you. I have a couple questions about like vaccine ingredients and chronic illness and stuff. But before I talk about that, I did want you to have a moment to share about some of the positive things. Because really, when I'm reading your book, the first thing I'm thinking is, okay, fine. If some kids have a seizure here and there, some kid, very small number of people are having these terrible, severe reactions. Now, I know this is going to be a little much to handle, but I'm thinking it's better for the common good for our society for us to, the benefit outweighs the risk. Like for your baby to die of measles is much more likely if we're not getting vaccinated than the small chance that it might have, your baby might have a seizure and recover. So that's just a super, like at the beginning of the book, that's what I was thinking. This is before I learned about anything else. Tell me, is there a part of you that can make an argument for certain vaccines and why they can be beneficial to children?
Of course. I mean, the whole beginning of the book and really the whole point is to understand the benefits of vaccines and then to compare that to the risks, right? And compare that to our understanding of the risks. And to me, if you want to answer the question and know what's best for your kid, you have to understand the risks, because what you just said is, well, shouldn't we just, isn't it better for everybody just to do it because we don't want measles to come around and you don't want to get measles? Well, that depends. That depends on what the risk from the vaccine is, right? If there is no risk from the vaccine, then of course, we know that the vaccines work very well. We know they can protect you from these diseases, and we know that they can minimize that risk for you and for other people. But that's not the full question. If you could take a magical pill and say, hey, give my kid this magical pill, they're never going to get sick, never going to cause any problems, everyone line up and do that, no problem. But the reality is, well, what does it do to you? What are the negative side effects? How bad are those side effects? How many kids are affected? And what is that risk? That is the thing that I think we need to figure out so we can actually understand that equation fully. And I don't think we have that right now. I think we do absolutely understand the benefits very, very well. And I think that we know that first, let's say let's go back like 100, 200 years, like people were dying of a lot of these diseases all the time, right? A lot of these diseases were very deadly, but we weren't that healthy. We didn't understand disease very well. We didn't have great nutrition. We didn't have great sanitation. We had horses pooping in the road everywhere. We didn't have sewer systems. You go back far enough, like all these things made a huge difference. And if you go through the early 1900s, you'll see, if you look at the graphs, that the death rates from a lot of these diseases plummeted well before vaccines ever hit the market. So if you go back and look at like early, whooping cough or other disease, like there were a lot of more deaths in 1800 than there were in 1950, right? Because the diseases have already dropped in terms of their death. But there were still a lot of kids getting a lot of these diseases. And so what you see after the vaccines hit the market was, for a lot of these diseases, then the disease almost went down to zero. So you weren't really having a lot of death anymore, but you still had a lot of kids getting sick, going to the hospital, getting pneumonias, meningitis, other things like that. So all that's also still bad. And with the vaccine, you see the cases go near to zero, and you see that they protected you from those. So that's still very, very good. But I don't think it's true that if we had no vaccines, we'd have a ton of death, because we didn't have a ton of death from these diseases before the vaccines hit the market. It's a very different time, but you still have a lot of kids getting sick. And I think the best example of that in our current history memory is chickenpox, because
I have a chickenpox little mark. I don't know if you can see it on my camera right here. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, kids aren't getting chickenpox anymore. That's weird. We did have chickenpox parties. I do remember this.
Right. And that's what the thing, when we were little, like, everybody had chickenpox basically, right? It was normal. It was fine. You had a chickenpox party, you get it. And so, yeah, for most kids, it's not a big deal, but there were still millions of cases of chickenpox every year. Some kids get really sick. Like a few kids could die. A few kids get meningitis. Women that are pregnant could get really sick. So from a public health perspective, he's still protecting people. And you can see how a vaccine could work in the sense that, well, everyone had it when they were little and now nobody has it basically anymore. So that's what happened with a lot of diseases. So there's a huge benefit there. But now I think the question is, okay, we understand the benefit of vaccines. We understand that the measles vaccine can protect you from measles, but at what cost? And I think that's a real and important question, because it's not to say that we shouldn't protect from measles, but the question is, if the current version of the measles vaccine causes problems, if it does increase your risk of autism, if it does increase your risk of asthma, if it does increase your risk of whatever it might do, we should try to figure that out, because then maybe we can make a vaccine that doesn't have those risks and also still protects you. Mm-hmm. You could do that. There's no reason to do it. And the polio vaccine is a perfect example of that, because we had the oral polio vaccine, and the oral polio vaccine is live. And it was given out for many, many years. And then we haven't had polio in America in like 40 plus years. And the oral polio vaccine, because it was live, reverted to actual polio in about 1 in a million cases. So it was giving people polio. There was no polio except from the polio vaccine. So we said, hey, we're giving more people polio than actual polio was giving to people. We should stop doing the oral polio vaccine because we have the inactivated one. And so we stopped giving the oral polio vaccine because it was causing more side effects than it was actually helping. You don't just give a vaccine just because. The benefits have to outweigh the risks. And if you're giving more people polio, that's not a very good vaccine. So I think we have to take that same mentality with the rest of the vaccines and not just assume that they're perfect, but say, well, how do we improve them? Can we improve them? Are they affecting us when we have all these new conditions that we're seeing skyrocketing that weren't the case before? And it just seems like medicine doesn't want to even ask that question. They're like, yeah, no, they're fine. They're safe. And there are just too many stories of people that say, I went in, my kid was okay. And then the next day they weren't. And that's important to listen to. And yes, it's a story. Yes, it's an anecdote. Yes, it's not research. But if 100,000 parents say the same thing, you got to listen to that and start to look into that research. There's got to be something there, and we have to study it.
Yeah, where there's smoke, there's usually fire. I mean, there's something there. And what I hear you saying is like, we just have to have better research, informed consent, and there's some of these laws, for example, vaccine companies not being able to get sued. That's kind of stunting our ability to provide better care and better vaccines. And we don't want to just be a status quo. We don't want to just stay where we are. We can be better. We can have better vaccines if we push in and lead into some of these hard questions. And even the fact that placebos aren't really placebos and that pharmaceutical companies can't get sued for vaccine injuries, and that they're not really motivated or incentivized to do longer studies or putting things out on the market as quick as they can. I mean, those are insider secrets that I don't know that many doctors knew maybe before listening to this. And I think it's important for people to know that so that we can call each other to be better, because there's no price tag that comes on your children's future health. And that's what I hear you saying. That's what I loved about reading your book, is I didn't feel like it was divisive or subjective. It's very much, here are the facts, and I'm sorry to be the one to tell you the facts, but this is it, and you can make your own decision,
Yeah, I'm happy to be wrong. I'm happy to be disproven. I'm happy to change my mind. I'm not here to tell people what to do. This is what I learned. This is what I've seen, and this is where I think that we can go forward together, because we're all on the same team. We all want healthy kids, and everybody agrees on exactly how to get there. But the goal for public health should not be more vaccines. The goal should be healthier kids, and that might include more vaccines, or it might include vaccines, but it might not. I mean, just because we have a vaccine doesn't mean it's always the right thing to do. I mean, you don't just give a million vaccines just because. Like, we don't just give everyone a yellow fever vaccine unless you're going to Africa, right? It's like you don't just do it. And we need to make sure that we have high standards. Like, what happens in a year if there are a couple cases of Ebola in some country? I don't know. Let's just say somewhere in Africa, they have a couple cases of Ebola. And then the CDC says, well, you know what? We haven't had an Ebola case in America in however many years, but we're going to make every 1-day-old baby get Ebola vaccine. We're going to do it. That we think it's for their protection. And they don't study it. They study it for 5 days. They study it against not an inert placebo. And they're like, oh yeah, give this another vaccine to your newborn baby. And you're like, well, do I want to do that? Like, is it safe? There hasn't even been Ebola. Like, I'm not really so worried about that right now. And that can't be the case. Like, we have to set higher standards. We have to say, look, if we're going to add something, we want the highest possible standards. If it's going to be new, it has to have placebo-controlled trials. We want better safety testing. Like, for hepatitis B, the safety trials on the insert say 5 days. 5 days of safety. Like, how could that possibly be enough? They studied it for 5 days. That's what they studied at pre-licensure on 147 kids. And you're like, that can't be true, right? There's no way. It's got to be studied on more people. We would never give a newborn baby something with that little safety testing. Well, it was, the government got sued, FOIA, by Aaron Siri to look for more data because he didn't believe it either. And they didn't have any more information about safety testing. So that's what it was approved based on. So like that to me is not anti-science. I'm like, that's not good enough. That doesn't mean that it's unsafe. It's just, if you're going to inject my 1-day-old baby with something, I want the best possible safety testing. I want it done on 100,000 kids. I want it followed forward. I want to look at all these things. I want to keep looking at it, because especially for something that's extremely rare and very unlikely for your child to get, I want to know that it's as safe as possible, even if it causes a problem in 1 in 100,000 kids. I don't necessarily want to take that risk for my kid if there isn't really a good benefit and if it hasn't been fully safety tested, because otherwise it might not be a 1 in 100,000 risk. Maybe it's a 1 in 10,000 risk or 1 in a 1,000 risk. And when the risk of you, let's say, getting hepatitis B is probably 1 in a million for a newborn, unless you have hepatitis B, you have to weigh those risks and the benefits for yourself. Obviously, if you have hepatitis B as a mom, there's a high risk for your baby. That's a very different calculation. Then that kid should get a hepatitis B vaccine. But for someone who doesn't have hepatitis B, the risk is really, really small. It's not zero, but it's small. And you need to understand where your baby might get hepatitis B from, but you also should be able to have that discussion and understand what your actual risk is, because we just dismiss the risk from the vaccine. And maybe there are more risks than we know. And I don't think that that's an unreasonable discussion to have and something to keep studying. That's all.
Sure. Do you happen to remember offhand, like when we were growing up, I'm assuming you're my age, but I have actually no idea, but I got vaccines in the early 80s. Mm-hmm. How many childhood vaccines did we get compared to how many childhood vaccines a baby who's being born, here in the 2020s is getting?
So before the Vaccine Act in 86, so in the 80s, you would probably had a DTP vaccine, polio, and measles. So you would have had a couple of DTPs, a couple polios, and maybe one or two, probably one measles. So usually it was like 5 to 10 at that time. If you got three different vaccines, but a couple doses of each. So usually like 5, 10.
Okay. And then now how many are kids getting?
Now it's 20, 30 upwards, and more than that. Okay. I mean, there's 16. You're usually doing about 20 in the first year or two.
In the first year or two. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then that brings me to one of my last questions, which is, so let's pretend parents are like, hey, I'm down to do these vaccines, but I don't want to do the combinations. Like, I don't want to do so many vaccines all on one day. Like at the 8-week visit, sometimes babies are getting a ton of vaccines. Is there a way to separate them? Like MMR is measles, mumps, and rubella. Do they make those separate? Is that an option? Or like DTaP is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. Is that able to get separated out?
Generally, no. So there are combo vaccines that have multiple. So you have like a DTaP, Haemophilus, polio together. You can separate those into singles, but you can't really separate MMR or DTaP. That's kind of how they are given. Okay. So you wouldn't really separate it smaller than that. I mean, it just brings up the very common debate about slow schedules versus not. And to me, I always say this when parents ask me, I can't recommend anything other than the CDC schedule, right? That's what's been studied. That's what's recommended. And anything outside of that is a personal choice. I think it's really arrogant to sit here and be like, oh, well, you should follow Dr. Joel's vaccine plan, not the CDC. Like that. There's a lot of smart people that have worked on it for a long time. That's what they recommend. And that's the schedule. If you want to do anything else, it's a personal choice, and you have to decide with your practitioners what makes sense for you. And there are a lot of people in my office that do that, and a lot of people choose to do them in different ways. And sometimes people want to do one at a time or just not as many on one day. So you'd have to come up with that. And usually people weigh the risks versus the benefits, and they go, okay, well, what's actually around? What can actually kill my baby? What's less likely for my baby to get? And that's how they weigh which ones they're going to do first versus which ones they do later. So you can do a slow schedule if your doctor is willing to do it with you. And generally the requirements are more for school, so you can get them all done no problem before school if you do a slow schedule. And there's not a ton of risk from doing it that way. It's usually just, obviously if you don't get a vaccine today and you get it a couple weeks from now, if you happen to get that disease before you get that vaccine, then you don't have that protection. But there are a lot of families that just, they only want to do one at a time. So they just come in more, which means, more visits and a little more time with the doctor. But other than that, it's not really a major issue. So that's kind of your downside, but people do it.
But you can't really do one at a time when it comes to DTaP, because there's 3
not
in there, right?
So the one at a time is the DTaP.
Okay.
Yeah, but there are 3 things in there.
Okay.
That's the smallest it goes.
Sure. Okay, but like one shot. So I love the title of the book, Between a Shot and a Hard Place. Tell me, just to kind of finish up here, is there, kind of last words or any last thoughts that you want to leave, expecting parents or new parents with when it comes to this topic of vaccinations? I know you've basically written all the things you want people to know in your book, so I am encouraging people to read your book. But anything that you wish that just a new parent would know before they enter this sometimes tumultuous landscape of vaccines and American healthcare system?
Yeah, well, I think with vaccines, it's such a controversial topic that I think it's really important to ask questions and do some research. And if you're going to read things, read more than one thing. I think that's always important. You can get a very, one-sided perspective from a lot of resources. And that's why the way I tried to write my book was not to be one-sided and to be more balanced. But, there are like people like Paul Offit that have very CDC perspective. And then you have some pretty anti-vax stuff out there that you could read too. And I think it is important to kind of see that landscape, so that way you have an understanding of where people are coming from. And I think it's important to understand that it's okay to ask questions. Every parent has some nerves and some concerns, and I think that's fine. And if you have those concerns, especially when it comes to vaccines, you just got to find a practitioner that you feel comfortable talking to. And I think that's really important. You shouldn't feel like it's woo-woo or out there to have questions. I think it's normal to have questions. If you're going to inject anything into your baby a whole bunch of times, then I don't see why you wouldn't have questions about that, and that should be fine. You should be able to ask those questions, and hopefully your doctor can make you feel comfortable with your decisions. But everything has a little bit of a risk, and that's just life. I mean, vaccines have a risk, and not vaccinating has a risk, and you have to decide what you're comfortable with. But ultimately, you do have to make those decisions for your kid, and the best way to do that is to become educated and then to ask questions of your trusted practitioners.
Right. I really appreciate you spending your time chatting with me and sharing your knowledge with our audience. I also really want to share with you that I know it's a huge risk for you to write about such a controversial topic. And in your book, you do discuss the risk to you and your, brand and your practice and your livelihood, because you, I'm sure, get a lot of hate mail for people who might put you in that category of anti-vaxxer. But I will say, after reading your book and being a little bit more on the side of just hurry up and get your vaccines and stop complaining, it really helped me to see a much more clear picture of why parents are a little bit concerned, asking questions, and where the holes are, where the gaps are in this topic. And I think if more people would be as easy to talk to about this topic and as well read on the topic, that we really could improve this part of our world. We really want excellence in the area of what we're injecting into our tiny babies. And I think it's your kind of perspective, your kind of approach to the topic that helps to open these doors so that you and I can have a conversation like this. And it's not contentious. Like, it's just like, this is what I'm seeing here. It doesn't mean you're a bad person or I'm a bad person. It doesn't say anything negatively about your character. Like, we're together trying to improve the health outcomes of future generations. And I really appreciate you taking that risk, because I know that's a heavy burden to carry,
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that, and I appreciate it. And surprisingly, it hasn't been that crazy. I thought it was going to be, but I think the time shifted a little bit, and people are much more open to talking about it. But yeah, I didn't know how it was going to go, and I have lots of conversations now with mainstream doctors, and I don't know, there hasn't been any name calling or fight. I think there's just no reason for that. I mean, you don't have to agree with me, but I've talked to people who are like super, super, super pro-vax, and they like don't have really arguments against most of what discussing, because I'm not trying to get people not to vaccinate. It's just like, this is what it says. And they don't necessarily have an argument back to a lot of that stuff because it doesn't exist. And that's fine. It's just, I think if we could have these kinds of conversations, that's what would move things forward. And that's why I wrote the book. It was, I think we have to have this kind of conversation, because that will bring people together, and people who are on the opposite side of the table, quote or unquote, whatever you want to call it. Like, okay, I understand why you have a little skepticism. Okay, I understand why you think these work. Sure. Let's meet in the middle somewhere, and that's all that I want. So hopefully that's what's coming through.
And I think the timing of your book is good, because wasn't it released in June of 2025, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. So it was a few months after the new administration. So kind of things changed. Good timing for that. So definitely get a copy of his book. I'm sure you can buy it on Amazon and all the places that you can buy books. And then we can put your link to your Instagram channel in our show notes and anything else that you would like to include. But I appreciate your time so much today. And I hope this helps empower patients and help bridge the gap in some of these areas that we can sometimes get divided in. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks for listening. To learn more about newborn feeding and get your free swipe file, visit milkdiva.com/newborn feeding. And if you've ever said, wow, I wish I would have known that while you're listening to this podcast, then help a friend out and share this podcast with them. You can also help us by leaving us a rating so more people can benefit from finding this podcast. Medical disclaimer. Please know that all opinions expressed on this podcast are solely my own and not intended to substitute the advice of a medical provider. I am not a medical doctor, and all information shared is intended for your general knowledge and is geared towards full-term, healthy singleton infants and healthy, low-risk pregnant or postpartum women.